guys, it's Aoife from Words of Clover and I'm here with my November wrap up. A little bit late, but better late than never. So the first two books I want to talk about that I read kind of in the very start of November and the very end of November into December is actually Hidden Bodies and You Love Me by Caroline Kepnes, and this is book 2 and book 3 in the You series following Joe Goldberg, who a lot of people know now as it became a very popular Netflix TV show. And Hidden Bodies was a reread for me, and then You Love Me was a new read for me. I hadn't read that yet, which is why I had reread You and Hidden Bodies this year, just to kind of refresh my memory, as it has been quite a few years since I read the original two books in the series. So we are following, in Hidden Bodies, we are following Joe as he leaves New York and ends up going to LA and trying to kind of, it obviously has to do with a woman that he's obsessed with, but then he's also starts kind of trying to figure out what's next for him. He just feels like he has to leave New York for a variety of reasons. He's a little bit like haunted in certain ways about things that happened in the previous book. And then we see him start up this new relationship with a girl called Love, and how this feels, you know, like every relationship that Joe ends up in, it feels like the real deal. He feels like he's finally found the person that he wants to be with. And then, similar to what happens in every book as well, there's generally people around the woman of his affections, whether it's friends, family, exes, things like that, that get in his way, and he kind of has to start figuring out ways to get these people out of their lives. Book 2, I enjoyed book 2. I really feel like book 2 wrapped up really well in terms of, I always feel like this is probably supposed to be a duology, and the way book 2 wrapped up, it kind of feels like Joe has been caught, he's been done. There's no like getting out of the situation that he's ended up in by the end of book 2. And it definitely feels like it, you know, it was kind of a neat little bow to those two books. And then what I feel like happened, I feel like obviously the Netflix show got really popular, and maybe the publishers and Caroline Kepnes both, I'm not really sure. I have a feeling that she was told to write more books. And then You Love Me was born, and then from this end of Hidden Bodies to the start of You Love Me, I kind of feel like it just didn't make sense for Joe to go from where he was at the end of book 2 to where he was at the start of book 3. And I feel like the explanations given were just really poor and like didn't really explain things very well, and was just a little bit of a easy like kind of get out of jail kind of literally like card. It was just, yeah, I was a little bit disappointed in how things like were kind of wrapped up and explained. You Love Me was kind of an interesting reading experience for me. I did talk about it a little bit in my recent vlog, which I will leave linked. I feel like the first half of it, I was slightly bored. I was listening to an audiobook and I found myself slightly bored because I felt like it was a real repeat of the first book in particular, in terms of his object of affection and then the people who were in his way to have a proper relationship with this person. And it kind of felt like he was doing almost the same things as he was doing in book 1. But then halfway through that, things change a little bit. Joe ends up being a little bit more in a more vulnerable position than we've seen him before. He's a little bit caught off guard in many ways, and in many ways as well, it kind of feels like this might be his most successful relationship yet. So there's lots of different reasons why it kind of it caught my attention a little bit more. Then I was a little bit more intrigued to see where it would go, and then the end of it felt, I don't know whether it felt a little bit rushed and a little bit like things again like just wrapped up a little bit, that I was just like, oh, okay, like I didn't love the ending. So it was kind of like a 3. Hidden Bodies was originally a 5 stars for me. I think now when I reread it would be more of like a 4 stars, where You Love Me is more of a 3.5 stars. I still really enjoy the books. I enjoy the character of Joe Goldberg because I think he's so interesting, so intriguing to read about and to be in his head. Like I love being in his head because he's so messed up, and it's quite a fun reading experience in many ways. But I do feel like for someone like Joe, there's only so many times you can tell the same story in slightly different ways, which is kind of what is happening. So I know there's a 4th book. I will eventually probably read it once it comes out in the library. Yeah, I'm kind of ready for it to be done. Like I'm ready to close out Joe's stories. And these two were definitely like, by the end of the 3rd one, I was like, okay, I think I'm ready to say goodbye to Joe. The next book I read was actually a really like surprising one for me. I was not expecting to love this book as much as I did and to give it 5 stars, and that's Ghosts by Dolly Alderton. I listened to this on audiobook and it was really good, and I was listening to this on audiobook one day where I wasn't feeling very well, and I was just like lay down in bed, and I was literally just lying in bed and listening to my audiobook, which never happens for me. Normally I have to be like doing something physical, whether it's walking or cleaning or doing a paint by numbers or something kind of creative like that. that's the only way I can kind of listen to audiobooks. I never really am able to like just sit down and not do anything and listen to an audiobook. I have to be doing something with my hands or something physical. Where with this time I literally just sat, like literally lay in my bed under the covers and just listened to the rest of this, and I had a really good time. I really enjoyed it. So in this book, we are following a character called Nina. She is 32. She's at the stage in her life where she's in many ways, she's been very successful. She's a cookbook author. She's after buying her own flat in London. In terms of her career, she is doing really, really well. But her dating life just hasn't been great. She broke up a few years ago with a long-term partner. She's still really good friends with him. He's moved on. He's in like a serious relationship now, but she is kind of just not even been focusing on her love life. She's been focusing on her career. And she's at that point now where like a lot of her friends and family are either, you know, they have children, they're like thinking about their second baby, they're getting married, they're in like very different stages of their life than she is, and she starts thinking about, okay, like I want to try and get back out there. And she ends up going on something similar to Bumble and ends up meeting this man who she has a really great first date with, and they immediately start a very kind of intense relationship, and things seem to be going really, really well, and then out of nowhere this guy ghosts her, and she has a really, really hard time like dealing with this, having no explanation, no answers as to why he suddenly like completely disappeared from her life when they were like really close for like 2 months. They were like, you know, seeing each other several times a week. They were like staying over in their houses. They were like, you know, there's a lot of like they were really involved, and you know, it was very hurtful for her to now not see him at all, not even get any answers as to why he has decided to not be in her life anymore. And then while all of this is happening as well, her dad is actually quite sick. He is suffering from early onset Alzheimer's, and that is increasing. In terms of his health is deteriorating. He's not really able to be alone anymore, and her mom are trying to figure out how to best care for her dad as well, and also as a family unit how they can support one another as well, and that's a really, really difficult thing for her to go through. So we see her dealing with that as well alongside everything else in the book. I just was totally hooked in the story. I think Dolly Alderton got this time of life really, really well, that in so many ways you can be so successful, but then just because you're maybe not loved up, or you're not or you're single, it kind of means that you're like failing in society in many ways. Not married and have a baby, then like there's something wrong with you, or there's something missing in your life, or people are trying to say that to you. And I really loved how this was explored in this book with Nina. I think like I'm literally like, I've just turned 32, so I'm like the same age as Nina and her friend group in this book as well. So I think in many ways I related to so much of what Nina was going through, and then what her friends were going through as well. Like I'm in that stage in my life now. I'm getting married next year. Some of my friends are already married, they have children, they're thinking about families. We're starting to think about whether that's something we would like to do. I have friends who are totally like on the other side of that, who aren't near that stage in their life yet and are happy to be doing what they're doing. And I just loved kind of seeing all of that reflected in this book as well, because it felt very real to real life. One thing I did find really weird in this book is that Nina is so close to her ex-boyfriend. She's with him for like I think 7 years before they broke up, and they're obviously like really, really good friends. And I did find it really weird that like out of all the people she wanted to introduce her new boyfriend to first, it was the ex-boyfriend. And I'm like, I just don't think that's like, I don't know, there was something about that relationship that I just really didn't like in this book. She was like his best woman, like kind of best man, like in his wedding, and I was like, that's kind of weird. And then she ended up going to the hen of the bride. That was weird. I just found all of that really weird, and I was like, don't think I needed like any of that in the book. But yeah, other than that, I really love this. Definitely will be reading Dolly Alderton's new book, which I think has just come out recently. And yeah, this was a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was actually quite a disappointment for me, and that was Ruthless Ends by Katie Wismer. And this is the 4th book in the Marionette series, so this is wrapping up this series for Katie Wismer. So in this book, we are following this, it's kind of like an urban fantasy setting. We are following a character called Valerie Darkmoor, who is a witch, and she lives amongst vampires. And in this world, when witches graduate from this like school that they go to, they're basically connected, they're like bonded up with a particular vampire. And when this happens to Valerie, she's bonded up with Reed, who is basically like the vampire prince in where she lives, and the two of them form this really like close friendship that eventually leads to a romantic relationship. But there's a lot of different things going on in this world. There's like secrets going on within like the vampire hierarchy, like political system, and there's also this like big bad villain who is trying to attack all of the estates and like killing some of the like the royal families and stuff like that within the vampires who rule like this world. So in the last like 3 books, we have seen Valerie trying to deal with that, and also dealing with a lot of stuff, like really dark stuff that's been going on with her own life, kind of family secrets that she has been finding out about as well, and secrets about herself, and about who she really is as well. And we've been seeing all of that happen. The first two books in this series I really enjoyed. I loved the vibes, I loved the sexy atmosphere. There were some really like hot and steamy scenes as well that were really nice, real spicy scenes between Valerie and Reed that I really enjoyed. I really liked their chemistry, I loved their relationship. The third book for me was quite a letdown in terms of like, I felt the pacing was really bad, and there was a lot of things that happened at the very end that it just felt very rushed for me, the ending. This one was kind of similar to the third one in that I just felt it suffered from pacing issues. I felt like the author, sometimes I was like, does she really know like what she wants to do with this story? It kind of feels like it fell apart somewhere between book 2 and book 3. And like there were things introduced, type of magic that was introduced in this book that was ended up becoming a really big plot point and introduced this whole new world that we never knew about before. And I was like, this is actually really interesting, but to squeeze it into book 4, like the very end book, just feels like it's doing everything a disservice, where this feels like it could be a whole book on its own, or something that should have been introduced from like the very end of book 1 if it's going to be such a big part of book 4. And I just felt like, yeah, there was a lot of answers in terms of the magic, in terms of the political system, that were never really resolved for me when it came to the series. This book as well really relied on very heavily for you to know every single character, which kind of annoyed me a little bit. So like there's been a gap of a year between book 3 and book 4 being published, and even in book 3 the character of Valerie was separated for that entire book from her friends and family because she was somewhere else. So there's characters in this that we haven't really seen since book 2, and even with that, like not that much. We're expected to know exactly who they are and what they mean to our main character in book 4, and to remember everyone, like besides her like 2 best friends who we do hear about a lot and who you do know about, but it's kind of like the other friends in that group, we're suddenly supposed to remember exactly who everyone is, all of their experiences, their past experiences, and their relationship with Valerie. And like I couldn't remember, none of these people meant anything to me. So that meant when there was a death in this book, it literally didn't mean anything. And I kind of felt like if there was going to be a death, it should have been a death of a main character, not someone who was like this side character who, to be fair, the reader like most likely won't even remember who this person is. So it has no like real like effect on the reader. Also, other characters in this just felt like they just needed to be like gone from the story. They weren't like, there was almost like a fake dating trope that was thrown in at one point in this book, and then it literally just went nowhere. It was so weird. I was like, why would you even introduce this if it's not going to be a big thing? Like it just doesn't mean anything. And then there was kind of like this love triangle hinted at, but not a particularly good one in book 3. They kind of like went on a little bit more in book 4, but again didn't really go anywhere. And then with this, there was like this really like out of nowhere like kind of 3-way sex scene that was just so like thrown in. Like, don't get me wrong, it was very steamy, it was very enjoyable to read, but in terms of the overall story that was going on in the book, I felt like it was just thrown in out of nowhere. And I feel like the author was like, oh well, I had this like these sex scenes in the previous books, I just need a really hot sex scene to throw in here. And I just felt like it just, in terms of the story, it just didn't do anything for me. Despite how enjoyable that steamy scene was, it didn't do anything for the story. I love the vibes, I love the sexiness of this world. It's very similar, like if you're a real like Vampire Diaries, True Blood kind of person, I think this is something you would really enjoy. But in terms of just like the follow through, I think from book 1 to book 4, in terms of satisfaction of how everything ends up, I just didn't think it was great. Now, in saying that, we do know now who the characters, who the spin-off series is going to follow. I am very intrigued by that relationship and those characters. So I will read a spin-off book from the series. But yeah, in terms of overall, in terms of this series, it was just a little bit disappointing for me. So I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book I read, I really loved. This one was an audiobook, and that was Britney Spears' memoir, The Woman in Me, and this was narrated by Michelle Williams. This is one that I just jumped on the hype train as soon as I heard about it. It was one I knew I really wanted to read, and I just really enjoyed finding out more about Britney Spears' story. Like, I was born in early 1990s, so I kind of grew up with Britney Spears being like the big pop star of my childhood. I remember one of my childhood friends had the Britney Spears like doll, and I was so jealous. I really wanted the Britney Spears doll. But yeah, I really love Britney. I listened to her, like I had her albums. She was probably one of the only pop stars really that like I really followed. She was like my first proper music concert, which was actually the Onyx tour, which she talks about in this book as being a tour that she was really miserable on. And now I'm like, oh god, like I went to see that when I was like 8 or 9. No, I wasn't 8 or 9. I was older. I was 11, I think. But I also remember that like that is like she kind of says it herself that like everything was very very sexualized in that tour, like in terms of the stage design and the dance moves and what she was doing. And I remember like my mom brought me to that show and she was completely scandalized about what was going to happening on stage. But obviously I was so young, I didn't realize what was being like done on stage. I was just happy to be in a Britney Spears concert. But yeah, I really enjoyed like listening to this in terms of learning about her childhood, about the early years of her pop stardom. Now, in terms of the writing, like the writing isn't the best writing in the world. There's definitely bits that I feel like she like didn't go into loads of detail, but this is her story. She can choose exactly how much she gives, like especially with everything she has gone through, how controlled she has been in her life by other people. This is the first time I feel like she's been really able to control the narrative of her own story, and she has every right to give as much or as little as she wants to the public. But learning about the conservatorship and what her family actually put her through was really eye-opening for me. And like they are not very nice people, if you ask me. But I just love this. I'm just so happy she was finally able to like share her story in the way she wanted to. And I think Michelle Williams did like an excellent job narrating. She doesn't sound like Britney at all, but I genuinely forgot it wasn't Britney like telling me the story. Like it did really feel like, I think the ghostwriter in this who did this did a really good job, because I did feel like it was very authentic to Britney's voice. And then again, Michelle Williams did a really good job narrating it. So yeah, this was a 5 out of 5 star for me. I just really, really enjoyed it. And the next book I read was Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare. This is Cassandra Clare's new non-Shadowhunter fantasy book. And this one I really enjoyed. This one was a really solid 4.5 out of 5 stars for me. In this book, we are in a brand new world where it's just called Castellane. We are following a young man called Kel, who when he was 10 years old, he was taken from the orphanage he grew up in, and he was brought to the basically like the palace. And he was told that he was going to act that he was going to kind of be something called a sword catcher for the prince of this kingdom, which basically means he was going to grow up side by side with the prince. They were going to be best friends, but his main job was to basically be the prince's kind of like bodyguard, but also stand in as a body double in like different scenarios. If they felt like there was something where there might be a risk to the royal family, a risk to the prince, Kel would stand in the place of Connor, and basically get hurt instead of Connor. And this is something he was told that he had to do from the time he was like 10 years old. And at this stage, I think when we meet them, they're in their early 20s, and he's like happy to do like his duty. This is something he feels like he wants to do. Connor is like one of his best friends. But then we start seeing him kind of explore a little bit more about things that are happening in the city, particularly the underground. We get hints of like an underground side of the world, and he starts exploring this a little bit more. And we're also following another character called Lynn, who is part of kind of a race of people who aren't treated very well in this world, and they are basically have to live away from a lot of other people. They're not allowed out after dark. They have to wear certain types of clothes, and they're kind of feared because years and years and years ago they would have been able to use magic, and even now they can still use a little bit of magic, but not too much, because magic's kind of been eradicated from this world, other than these kind of small type of like amulet things that they make. And Lynn is a really, really good physician, and she ends up being called into the palace one day, and that's how she meets Kel and Connor, and she kind of forms a friendship with them as well. And we kind of see how their lives kind of start interweaving. There's like political things going on, marriages, arranged marriages, uprisings, kind of unrest within the city. And we see how Kel, Connor and Lynn all deal with what is going on. This I felt was really good. I thought the writing in this was really, really strong. I really love the fact that in this world, it's very, very diverse in that, you know, it's very clear that the characters, or at least Kel and Connor for sure, are most likely pan. I think I thought they were bi, then I heard someone else talk about how the world is basically like everyone is like pansexual, and that's actually a lot more like probably true way of describing them. You know, the kings can marry kings, queens can marry queens, like it's not a big deal. And there's ways of like having children that they can do, like in terms of uh family line, like there's ways that like that can be done, that it was just so easily slotted in. I was like, it just goes to show that any fantasy book could have something like this. Like it's not a hard thing to imagine, and there's ways of this being like a thing that can be in any fantasy book. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Again, the writing was really good. I loved the kind of the hints we got about the underground. I love the fact that that's probably what we're going to be exploring a lot more in the second book, which I'm really excited about. I will say this book is quite slow. It's very slow burn. It's very I wouldn't say ploddy, but it's building up a lot. This is a very like big world. It's one that you really need to understand, like the political schemings, how this world works in terms of trade agreements and families and noble families, who it's not just a royal family that like is the be all and end all here. They rely a lot on the noble families, and we learn all about that in this book as well. So there's a lot to really understand about how this world works, and why, like, and how that will work for Kel and Connor in the future as well. So yeah, I think you have to be kind of, it's not one for a newbie fantasy reader. I don't think. I think you've had to read a little bit of high fantasy before to really get, or to really enjoy like what is going on in this. But I kind of enjoyed the slow pace. I kind of love the fact it was very character focused rather than really plotty. So I really enjoyed it. I loved kind of the chemistry between certain characters, the romances that were hinted at. It's not like, there's a little bit of romance in this book, but there's not a huge amount, which I enjoyed. I liked the fact that the romance was a real kind of like step back, where the political and the world itself was the main focus of this book. So I really enjoyed it. But 4.5 out of 5 stars. Really loved it, and I'm really looking forward to reading the next book when it comes out. Then I read Cruel Acts by Jane Casey, which is the next Maeve Kerrigan book that I needed to read, which is a series following a DI inspector, Maeve Kerrigan, as she investigates a number of different murders. And we are following Maeve as she is investigating a murder case where the perpetrator has been found, but he's now being kind of let off, I think on parole, or like something about the case has fallen through, so they have to reinvestigate the case to basically like trial him again and find him guilty again. So she is going back over an old case, trying to figure out if there were things that were missed, and she's finding a lot of like different things that were missed the first time around, and it starts pointing to the fact that potentially the person who had originally gone down for this murder may actually be innocent. So she's looking into this. Again, we're kind of seeing some things have been happening in her personal life. We see a new kind of romantic connection for her come in. I actually have read the book after this. It was the first book I read of the series, and I went back to the start and read them all again. So I actually know where this romantic connection leads up to. So it was kind of interesting to see the very start of that I didn't see before, when I read the next book after this. So yeah, this was fine. It was like a 4 out of 5 stars for me. Again, I think there's times where like, basically if someone is going to get hurt in an investigation, it will always be Maeve. Maeve will always be the person who has something dramatic happen to her. It's just like the way this series runs, and sometimes it's like exciting, and sometimes it can get a little bit like, oh god, like Maeve's at it again, and this kind of felt a little bit like that at times. I'm like, why is it always you? But I still did enjoy it. I always enjoy these books. They're always like fast paced. They're always like, they're kind of the books that you just keep reading because you really want to find out what happens. I didn't find it particularly twisty or particularly plot turny, but I still enjoyed it for exactly what it was, which is a crime thriller that I enjoy reading. I love the characters. So yeah, a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was a book called The First Woman by Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi. Hopefully I said that right. This also has another name, which is called A Girl as a Body of Water. So I don't know, depending on which country you're from, I'm not sure which countries use which title. But this one I read on audiobook, and this one was an interesting one for me because I wasn't really sure how I felt about it for a while, and I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars in the end. We're following a girl called Karabo, and we follow her she's growing up in Uganda, in the small Ugandan village, and she's been raised by her grandparents. She never knew her mother, and her father had her when he was really young, so he's off like working in the city, and she's happy kind of growing up with her grandparents. She's surrounded by love. She's loved very, very much by her family, and she sees her father occasionally when he comes back from the city. But she obviously has a lot of questions about her mother and who her mother is, and she eventually turns to the village, a woman who's kind of known as the village witch called Nansubuga, who is actually old friends of her grandmother, but now they're enemies. And Crabbo eventually turns to Nansubuga to ask her, like, what happened to my mother? Do you know her? Can you find out what happened? Like, can you make a spell and let me know like who my mother is and how I can find her? And we kind of see all this through a bunch of like stories and fables and things like that, that I think are, I presume, rooted in Ugandan history. I listened to this in an audiobook, and as I said, and I really did enjoy it. I think the narrator did a really gorgeous job bringing a lot of these like Ugandan folklore tale to life in a really lyrical way, and it was a lovely book to listen to, especially with all the accents that the author or the narrator did. She did like really good accents for it. Now I obviously don't know if those accents were correct, but I did really enjoy. They were lovely to listen to. Enjoyed the middle part of this book as we see Karabo grow a bit older. She becomes a teenager, and then she ends up going to the city and going to boarding school, and we see some of her experiences being in boarding school in the city, and also being in school while the Ugandan Tanzania war. So this is happening in like the end of the 1970s into the 1980s, and we see how the Ugandan Tanzania war kind of like was raging on while she was in school, and how it was affecting some of the people that she was in school with, and that was just kind of interesting because it's something that I didn't really know much about before. There's a real emphasis in this book on what it means to be a woman, particularly in this type of society at the time, but also a woman with like sexual needs, looks that can bring men to her, and how she has to try and be in control of that and not let people take advantage of her. We also see like in this book Karabo does have kind of an unusual upbringing in many ways, because her grandfather in particular is very like forward leaning in his thinking, I think, about women and education and getting a good job, and not that like women and like his daughters and granddaughters aren't there just to marry men and to have children. He wants them to go out and have like a proper like job and education and have a real life before they eventually maybe want to marry and have children. And we see that reflected on Karabo and what they want for her, and I enjoyed that, and I really loved her relationship with her grandfather. It was really, really sweet, and it made me miss my granddad a lot when I was reading this, because it was just a really, really sweet one, and if I talk about that anymore I'll probably cry. But yeah, I really enjoyed that. It was really nice. I did think there were some elements of the story that felt slightly maybe unfinished, or just maybe not explored quite enough. There was obviously her relationship with her mother was like was very big at the start, and then it kind of went away a little bit in the middle, and by the end it kind of came back, and the way it kind of ended up was not necessarily completely satisfactory, probably quite realistic in many ways. And I did love kind of the relationship between Nansubuga, her grandmother I should say, and Karabo. All of that was really nice, and there was a really lovely scene at the very end between the three of them that I really enjoyed, and kind of like women like supporting each other and being there for each other and being joyful and beautiful all together. That was really, really lovely. So yeah, I enjoyed this book. I didn't absolutely love it, but I did enjoy it. I really love learning more about Ugandan culture and history. And yeah, I would definitely read more from the author. So yeah, I enjoyed it. After that, I read a book for Nonfiction November, and that was Natural Year by Michael Fewer. This is a book I've been wanting to read for ages, and this is basically just a year of like nature. Michael Fewer is a journalist, and he basically is narrating a year of nature around him, both in his home in Dublin and then also his holiday home that he has in Waterford. And he's talking about just what he's seeing during the seasons, and what he normally sees, what he has like seen changes in nature and the type of wildlife that comes into his garden, things he's had to do to maybe help nature or curb nature in different ways in different areas. And I just really love this. This is a very relaxing, lovely kind of book, and it's kind of one that I'm happy to keep on my shelves, and maybe different days or different seasons, if I want to remind myself of kind of like what to look out for, like outside my front door or in my like out my back garden or somewhere, I could flip through to like a year or to any season to a month and see what he's talking about, and seeing if I can spot anything similar. Or it's kind of like a lovely moment to, it's like a lovely book to remind yourself of, to take a moment and to observe nature and see the beauty of what is around you, and to stop kind of, I think we live such a fast-paced life right now where we all seem to think that we have to be hustling all the time, and this is a book that kind of reminds you that it's okay to sit back, have a cup of tea, like sit in your kitchen and just look out the window and look at the birds like on the bird table enjoying their little feast that you've put out for them, and taking those moments for yourself, even if it's just like 5 to 10 minutes every day. I think this is a really good book that reminds you to do that, and I really enjoyed this for that. So I gave this a kind of like a 4.5 out of 5 stars, but a really lovely book, and one I would definitely recommend people reading. And I mean, the book is just absolutely beautiful. I say every time I've shown the cover of this book, but it is just stunning, and every month has a little like illustration and a kind of like a quote or a poem from a poem and stuff, which is just a lovely book to have on your shelf. The next book I read was like for non-fiction November and for like the Buzzwordathon, and that was A Good Man with a Dog by Roger Guay, I think it is. And this one is actually a DNF for me, and it's kind of a weird DNF because I was reading this and I wasn't loving it, to be honest. It's about a man who was a game warden in Maine, and he's kind of talking about his experiences doing that, how he got into it, and the whole thing was a good man and a dog. So he's going to be talking about like, you know, search and rescue, like cadaver, searching, stuff like that with his dog. And I was looking forward to getting to that bit, but the first like 50 to 60% of this book is basically him talking about like hunting stuff, like not him hunting, well, some of it is him hunting, but also kind of tracking hunters who are doing bad things, including like people who are fishing and stuff, and basically doing all of this like against the law, like things around like, you know, like night hunting and using particular lights, and how they try and catch these people, and how it can be quite dangerous because obviously like this is America, these people have guns, like it's literally hunting, and how dangerous this can be at different times. And some of that was interesting for me, but also some of it really wasn't. And I'm not really like, I'm a vegetarian as well, so like I'm not really into hunting at all. I think there's an element of it in terms of like population control, I understand as well, but there's just an element of like men hiding in like a bush and shooting gorgeous creatures that I'm kind of like, what about that makes you think that you're a big man? Like that, I find that very like gross. So that kind of element of it I don't really like. So there was a lot of hunting in this that I was like really bored about, and it was just so boring to me, and it was taking a long time to get to the actual like doggy bits. And I was just getting to the doggy bits, and then I went on holiday and I started reading Eragon by Christopher Paolini, which was a reread for me, and it was one that I was really excited to read. So I started reading Eragon in Donegal, and I really enjoyed it. It gave that a 5 out of 5 stars. I think everyone knows what Eragon is about a boy and a dragon. And basically I think I finished Eragon, and I had gone on to something else. And I started thinking, I was like, did I finish that book? And I went back and I was like, oh no, I only got like 60% through of A Good Man with a Dog. And I was like, I really like don't want to read the rest of this. And this like never happens to me. I just like was like, I just don't want to read this. So I called it quits at 60%. So it's a DNF for me. Like 3, I can't really give it a rating because it is a DNF. I give it like 3 out of 5 stars. I think if I'd gone on further, I would have gotten into the actual doggy bits, which was the bit that was interesting for me. But yeah, for the first half of the book, it was like 2.5 stars. Like, really wasn't into it at all. So yeah, and then obviously after that I said I read Eragon, which was a reread for me, read it years ago, and this is about a boy called Eragon who ends up finding a dragon egg which hatches, and the two of them bond and they become dragon and dragon rider, and they have to start training to go against like basically the king of this land, who's really evil, and they have to join up with the kind of the rebel forces to learn how to fight together, how to do magic, and it's just really fun. So this was the first book in that, and I really enjoyed that. I talked about that more in my vlog that I have already put up. So this was a good like 5 out of 5 stars for me, and I just really enjoyed it in terms of like nostalgia and rereading a book that I read when I was a teenager, and it was just so much fun to read this again. So I really enjoyed it. And the last book I want to talk about is an audiobook that I listened to for Non-Fiction November, and that was Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener. This is a memoir, and it's about Anna, who she originally started out in publishing, and she ends up moving from publishing into like a more like a tech role. She eventually goes into kind of customer support within like the tech companies, and she moves from New York to San Francisco and starts working kind of like in Silicon Valley, working within these big tech companies and getting experience of what it's like to work with a tech company, all the highs and lows that kind of come from that. And I really enjoyed this one, mostly because I think in terms of my own like experience within my career, I don't like I haven't worked for like within an actual tech company, but I've worked kind of like adjacent to tech in many different ways, and I worked alongside, you know, developers, and have worked as like, you know, with product support. So like I'm marrying a developer, so like tech in many ways is like a big thing in my life as well, and like big tech companies, like it's something that in terms of my career is something that I'm very aware of as well, and I will actually be making a move next year that will make this even a bigger thing in my life. So it was really interesting to read this book, because I really understood a lot of what Anna Wiener was talking about when she was talking about some company culture, the hustle, the expectations, but also kind of some of the fun and the kind of water cooler type of moments that you get in these offices, and the type of like people you see in these offices as well, from like the type of things people wear to the type of people that like, these CEOs tend to be like, and how they tend to treat people at times as well. Now obviously I'm in Ireland, which is a very different type of employment law as well, thankfully. There was just a lot in this that I was like, I really understand where she's coming from, and I understand exactly what she means when she's talking about this, especially in terms of like, I think there was times she was stretching a little bit in terms of not necessarily privilege. Like I think she was still coming from a very privileged position as someone who was white and a woman, and also someone who, she kind of says herself at the start, living in New York was quite difficult on like quite a bad pay, but she also had some family money, or like some support from her family to help her a little bit. And then she made this move and she starts making a lot more money, but she's not necessarily like the happiest she's ever been. And I think in many ways she is still talking from a big place of privilege in terms of, as I said, being a white straight female. While being a female in tech is still very hard, it's so much harder if you're, you know, a person of color, a woman of color, or you know, queer in any way as well. So yeah, there were times where she was kind of talking. She was kind of, it took a while to get to the point where she was kind of talking about being a woman in tech, and I felt like part of it was a slight stretch at times, but I would love to know what other people think who have read this book as well. I enjoyed this, as I said, I related to a lot of the experiences, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, so I enjoyed it. So that is everything I read in November. Please let me know what you guys think if you've read any of these books. See you guys again next time. Bye.